Good morning. I'm Tom Cherryholmes with LinuxMCE. After a long day of squashing a very nasty bug, I thought I would do something fun. Geeky, but a little fun. I'm going to use the game player features inside of LinuxMCE to walk through the various versions of one of my all-time favorite games, Space Invaders. Space Invaders was a game that was designed by a game company in Japan called Taito in 1978, which basically defined the entire shoot-'em-up genre, the granddaddy of all shoot-'em-up games. Now, we're going to start this adventure by playing the original version of the game that was made for the arcade. And then we're going to compare that with the various versions for different home computers and game systems that I have here in my collection. We'll start with the arcade version of Space Invaders. Now, it is worth noting here that this version, the original version of Space Invaders, actually what you're seeing is mostly illusion here. The actual display itself is the letters and symbols that you're seeing there in black and white. They're given color by two different processes here. The first being pieces of cellophane that were actually applied to the monitor to simulate the green and the red areas below and above respectively. But also the background that you're seeing was actually painted onto a wooden surface that was reflected by a mirror onto the mirror that you see when you actually look at the display. This actually gives the full illusion of seeing this wonderful, full-colored moon landscape back behind everything. When in reality, if we actually turn this off, all we would actually see would be just the game graphics. I'm going to leave them on for the full experience. Now we'll go ahead and do a quick game here, just for the sake of argument. We can hear the sound effects and see the gameplay. Now, things to note here. Number of invaders, 11 by 5 in the original game, but also take a look at how the invaders are moving. They're not all moving at the same time. They're a little bit behind each other, and believe it or not, that's actually based on a limitation of the display system. And as we start removing invaders, with each invader that we remove, the game gets progressively faster. Believe it or not, these two things that I just mentioned were not intentional pieces of the design, but were side effects of the design of the particular hardware in the system. Upon seeing these limitations during the game development, the game designers decided to leave this in the game. All of the sound effects that you're hearing here are being provided by discrete sound circuits. So, there we go, the arcade version of Space Invaders. Now, for the rest of this demonstration, I'm actually going to use a playlist that I've put together to show the different versions of the home computer and game system versions of Space Invaders, respectively. We select it, and we start. And we begin with the Atari 2600 version of Space Invaders. As we can see, it looks nothing like it. But it's made up for the fact that there are 112 different variations of the game, which I honestly find quite astounding when you think about it, because it basically allows you to play many different versions and variations of the game at a given time. Now, for some reason, I can't seem to get into it. Let me go ahead and see if I can trigger. There we go. This was the version of Space Invaders that many people remember playing on their game systems at home. And it's a good version of the game. The gameplay is very smooth. However, unlike the original game, all the Space Invaders move at the same time, and the gameplay doesn't really get faster until more of the Space Invaders are removed over time, and it's definite increments. It's not a smooth progression. Also, you'll notice too that the Space Invader shapes aren't authentic. But even despite these, and despite the fact that there are only 6 invaders per row, again due to the limitations of the 2600 hardware, the game itself is actually very enjoyable. So, with that in mind, we go on to the next one. The next version, it's the Atari 800 version. This was written by Rob Fulop at Atari, and arguably I think it's the worst one of the bunch. So much so that I'm just going to show the splash screen and I'm not even going to bother playing it. Basically, more of the same. A lot of just custom invaders here and there. We won't even go into it. Mostly because I will go ahead and go to the next version, which is the Atari 5200 version. The Atari 5200 version is marginally better than the Atari 800 version. It was written by a different programmer, but once again, we see the invaders are different shapes. And the play is very strange, given the fact that the invader's ship moves very fast, smoothly, but perhaps a little too fast for anybody's own good. The shooting is accurate enough. There aren't that many invaders per line. The invaders in this particular version, though, are actually very smooth and have a lot of different frames of animation. But again, you see a stair-step change in speed, and the gameplay in this one happens so quickly that it becomes very easily for you to become overrun. It's made up by the fact that there aren't as many authentic invaders per line, so perhaps it all balances out. That's the 5200 version. Moving on. We have the version for the SG-1000. This is the Sega SG-1000. It also works in the Sega Master System as well. Now, with this, you'll immediately see, again, authentic play. And a nice thing is they've actually tried to mimic the movement of the invaders, as well as the number of invaders per line. The color palette is something a bit closer to Invaders Part 2. I can see why they tried to add color to it. It makes it quite nice, and the color palette choices are pleasing. The shields are good. The bullets are maybe a little bit fast. And the low resolution of the SG-1000 may make the display a teeny-weeny bit crowded, but ultimately, a very nicely played version of Invaders here. That plays quite nicely. Moving onward, we'll go ahead and actually show the Super NES version. And the Super NES version is actually very nice because they actually tried to mimic the original gameplay. However, due to the fact that for some reason, even though all the buttons are mapped correctly, it won't let me hit start. I suspect that this is a particular bug within the ROM, so I'll just show the game display really quickly. As you can see here, a pretty decent implementation of the game here. The invaders move quite nicely. The game display is zoomed in a little bit. Same number of invaders per line and everything moves the same. But they didn't put in the color overlays. A little nitpicky, but ultimately I suspect a very nice implementation of the game. Moving onward. This is a version for the Apple II. And this one's actually quite nice. I'm actually very impressed. It makes very good use of the Apple II's high-res mode to create a black and white version of the Space Invaders. Now it is worth noting here that in high-resolution mode here, color artifacting is definitely present. But I don't think it detracts very much from the game itself. So, I mean, with that, we can go ahead and you can see that the gameplay is very nice, very smooth. The movement of the invaders is quite nice. The shapes and the sprites are correct. The only thing that lets you know that this is a computer version that you're playing on the Apple II is basically the fact that you see the color artifacting that's present. But other than that, honestly, a very good implementation. It's quite impressive. Moving onward. This one is very special because this is the VIC-20 version of Space Invaders, which they called Avenger. It's worth noting that Avenger was created by HAL Laboratory. HAL Laboratory being the most prestigious game development house in Japan. They started many of their first development work doing games for the VIC-20. As you can see here, it plays pretty nicely. The invaders move asynchronously. The invaders are the right sprite sizes. They've made some improvements to the game to take advantage of the VIC chip's color. And they borrowed the palette kind of as close as they could to Invaders Part 2, which is the color-modified version of Space Invaders. And it plays quite nicely. It's all nice and smooth. The only critique of this particular version would be the limited resolution of the VIC-20, perhaps, makes it a bit crowded to play, but ultimately quite nice. They also made a version for the Commodore 64, which was also quite nice. This one, of course, takes advantage of the enhanced resolution and sound capabilities of the VIC to provide something a bit closer to a vintage Space Invaders experience. If I only had one nitpick about this particular version, however, it would be that the invaders all move at the same time. This is indicative of using the VIC's hardware scroll registers to solely move the invaders. Understandable. It makes the game easier to program and a lot more efficient to display, if it does detract from the authenticity just a little bit. Moving on. We have Space Invaders 91 for the Sega Genesis, when they have basically gone all out here and gone all 16-bit, making a full-blown soundtrack and lots of power-ups and shields and other little bits and pieces that are indicative of a 16-bit game. And as a shoot-'em-up, it plays quite nicely, even if it is perhaps not authentic in the least. So, one last version that I'll show you is the PC Engine version, which is honestly, given the 16-bit nature of the system and the insane splash screen here, and the start screen, nothing more than a warmed over version of Space Invaders Part 2 without any of the backgrounds. I hope you guys have enjoyed this particular little demonstration. LinuxMCE allows you to see many different games alongside each other so that you can play them all together, you can compare them, or quickly create playlists of all your favorite games, or to do something entirely geeky like what I've done here. Until next time, guys, have fun. I hope you enjoy it. See you guys later.